Watching Australian Agenda, where we're talking now to senior Labor strategist and Rudd confidant, I suppose it'd be fair to say, Bruce Hawker, who's just put out a new book titled The Rudd Rebellion, The Campaign to Save Labor. Thanks for your company.
Pleasure.
I'll hold the book up there to give you the due publicity.
Just keep it up all the time.
I'm sure that our director will get copies on the table. You've brought one along, I noticed. But before we get to the book, though, Bruce, I want to ask you about, as a strategist, about the decision by Bill Shorten on Friday before he went on holidays and didn't put anyone out on the weekend programs to announce that they would basically be defending the carbon tax and linking any repeal of it to introducing the emissions trading scheme. Do you agree with that strategically?
Well, I certainly believe that we should be wedded to an emissions trading scheme. That was what we went into the election with. When we said no to the carbon tax during the campaign, we campaigned on that. So, yes, I do think we should be campaigning for an emissions trading scheme. My view, though, is that once that amendment is put in the Parliament, and if it fails, then I think it's up to the opposition then to say, well, it's your policy, you run with it, and let's see how it goes. I remember Paul Keating in 1993 when Houston was introducing or promising to introduce a GST, saying, don't think we're going to block this in the upper house. Don't think that you can vote Conservative in the lower house and Labor in the upper house. You can't. We won't block it. And I thought that was a very effective strategy.
Well, just how serious do you think the potential risks are for Labor in this, in the sense that they may appear to be ignoring the will of the people, supporting carbon pricing, and what sort of damage do you think Tony Abbott could do to Bill Shorten on this issue?
Well, I think Labor should continue the argument for a price on carbon, and that's effectively what an emissions trading scheme is. But I think the problem for us is that it can be a distraction and it can be a wedge issue. And Labor's suffered from wedge issues in the past. We saw that around national security in 2001, 2004. I worry about that. So time will tell, but I really feel in my bones that we would be better off saying our policy is an emissions trading scheme. You've decided that you're going to go down this direct action course. You're going to get it in anyway in 12 months' time or less. Let's see how you go with it.
Well, it's one of the problems here that Labor is listening to its own membership, its own rank and file, what they might want, not what the Australian public wants.
Well, it's a perennial problem for politicians, of course, and that's something you cannot ignore. I mean, the party, if you ask anybody in the party what their view was, they would take a very strong position on this issue. And that's part of the challenge for Labor. You know, Labor does stand for things. They don't just stand against things, they stand for things. So that is a problem. And I think it will continue to be an issue for Labor in the short term, but they do have to move on to other issues. And if they don't and get stuck in this space, it's not a very good one.
All right, the title of the book is The Rudd Rebellion. The subtitle is The Campaign to Save Labor. How do you correlate that with the primary vote, which was the lowest in 100 years for the Labor Party?
Well, we were looking at Armageddon, frankly, before Rudd took over the leadership. We were probably going to have perhaps 30 seats in the Parliament. In the end, the swing against Labor, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, the real battleground states, was quite small. We lost 2 seats in Queensland. There's about 30 seats that the government holds by a margin of less than 3%. It wasn't a terrible outcome, but it wasn't a good outcome. I'm not trying to pretend that. But every cabinet minister was returned, and they're in the Parliament now in an opposition.
Did you reject the argument, though, that the problems that Labor had when its vote was as depressed as it was under Julia Gillard was because of white-handing from Rudd supporters?
Yes, I think there were fundamental problems. The problem really goes back to the way in which Rudd was removed in 2010 and all the unhappiness that flowed from that, including white-handing on both sides. I'm not trying to deny that that was an issue. It was, but there were much more fundamental issues at play there that were a real concern, including the carbon tax, I've got to say. So Labor does need to put all this period behind itself, in my view, analyse it, and that's what I try to do, try to give people a bit of an insider's view on what it's like to be in a campaign, but now, move to the future.
Talking about the campaign, Bruce, I've read the book, as you know. What comes to me most strongly through it is the dysfunction at the heart of the Labor campaign. Now, I accept that from your perspective you were doing the best that you can, but your criticisms of George Wright and the campaign headquarters in Melbourne throughout the entire book, they are significant, they are are extensive across a whole range of issues, from policy to strategy to all sorts of things, staffing and right throughout the book. On Friday, Labor has announced a review into the campaign, which will include a section of that terms of reference, which they say it has been said to me is aimed at you, which is to do with campaign decision making. So can you give us an insight into the disconnect between yourself and the travelling party and the Labor campaign headquarters in Melbourne?
Well, for a start, I'd say I am critical of aspects of the campaign, our own travelling party as well. But that doesn't really extend particularly to George. I think George inherited a real problem. They were going into a campaign in a highly defensive mode when Gillard was the Prime Minister. They had to change the way in which they did things. They had a very short time, and we all had a very short time in which to turn things around. So from time to time, I guess there was something of a disconnect, but I wouldn't overstate that. We had twice daily phone hookups with the campaign headquarters. I think there were some people in the campaign, though, who were still unhappy with what had happened, with the change, and I think that meant that, the goodwill that would probably be there in an election campaign was absent, and it was easy to pick up the phone and speak to a journalist and say, do you see what they've done now, see what they've done now? And that's not a good thing.
You were clearly frustrated with the campaign headquarters in Melbourne, and you write a number of times that you thought that the people in that campaign were leaking against you deliberately and against the travelling party and were causing damage to Labor.
Well, there were some people that were doing that. That's undeniable. You only have to look at the reports from the time to show that there were people who were talking to journalists, not just on the News Limited side. The Fin Review had well-placed sources inside the campaign. I don't think they represented the overwhelming majority by any stretch of the imagination of the campaign. I think there were 2 or 3 people in there who were intent on providing a running commentary. And when things didn't go well, they were quick to point it out, and I think that was a shame.
Well, looking at it from the perspective of the Rudd camp, what comes through the book is that Rudd's office, yourself and Kevin Rudd in particular, are calling the shots. So this is where the onus lies, this is where the responsibility lies. Could you have done it any better in terms of calling the shots? Because I think one of the problems with the campaign, albeit you didn't have much time, but one of the problems with the campaign was there seemed to be too much moving around, the lack of a concerted strategy, particularly on the economy. In retrospect, could you have done better from the leader's office?
Look, I'm sure we could have. I think probably from time to time we did too much in a day, for example. We probably could have stripped events out. There could have been a bit more message discipline. That was difficult, though, and I've got to say that this is a News Limited issue I'm going to raise now, when from time to time, you had strong front page editorials being run in both the Courier Mail and the Telegraph, which had the effect of blowing us off course. I think that was a real problem for us. Rudd would spend half a press conference talking about what he didn't say to a makeup artist. So those things were problematic for us. I'm not saying that we got it all right, but time, as I point out in the book, was our enemy from the start. There were 74 days from when he took over as leader to when the election.
Could you have won if Rudd had become leader earlier on?
Well, that's one of the great ifs, of course, but I think I think it would have been much easier to put together the sort of campaign that you want, that you're saying we should have. But you remember, in those first few weeks, Rudd did an amazing number of things. He basically introduced the Papua New Guinea solution, which he did himself. He negotiated that, did away with the carbon tax, reformed the party, but the big issue, as you point out, Paul, that we never got on top of was economic management.
Well, it's all in the book, and we're right over time. The book, for one last plug, is The Rudd Rebellion, the campaign to save Labor. We've been talking to Bruce Hawker, key Labor strategist. Thanks for your company on this episode of Australian Agenda.
Pleasure.
And thank you to the panel, one and all, and thank you for watching.